Melissa Lucio's life took a shocking turn in 2008 when she was sentenced to death for the tragic loss of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah. But was it truly a case of murder or a terrible accident misunderstood by the justice system? Over a decade later, Lucio's story resurfaced, gaining worldwide attention when high-profile figures like Kim Kardashian joined the fight to save her life. With her execution narrowly halted in 2022, the question remains: is Melissa Lucio an innocent woman trapped by a flawed system, or does justice demand the ultimate punishment? Stick with us as we unravel the twists and turns of this dramatic case, from courtroom battles to political pressure, media frenzy, and the voices of those fighting for and against her survival. In February 2007, the small town of Harlingen, Texas, was shaken by the tragic death of 2-year-old Mariah Alvarez. The youngest of 14 children, Mariah was known for her bright smile and curious spirit. Her life, though short, had brought joy to those around her. But on that fateful day, everything changed. Melissa Lucio, Mariah's mother, frantically called for help after her daughter fell unconscious. According to Lucio, Mariah had taken a tumble down the stairs of their overcrowded home, a heartbreaking accident that no parent ever wishes to experience. When paramedics arrived, they found Mariah unresponsive, her tiny body bruised and battered. It was a grim and painful sight that raised immediate questions. The medical team rushed Mariah to the hospital, but it was too late. The toddler was pronounced dead, leaving her family devastated and struggling to comprehend what had happened. As the news spread, local authorities became involved, their focus quickly shifting from the tragedy itself to Melissa Lucio. Detectives zeroed in on the mother, questioning her parenting and her role in the events leading up to Mariah's death. To them, the bruises on Mariah's body told a sinister story, one that went beyond a simple fall. They suspected abuse, a pattern of violence that culminated in the child's untimely death. Melissa Lucio's life wasn't easy. Struggling to raise 14 children, she faced unimaginable challenges. Poverty, stress, and an abusive relationship with Mariah's father had left her emotionally and physically drained. She was far from the ideal picture of a mother, but those who knew her described her as someone who deeply loved her children, despite the hardships. Still, the authorities were unconvinced. That night, as Melissa was reeling from the loss of her daughter, she was taken into custody for questioning. What followed would become one of the most pivotal and controversial moments in her case. Inside the interrogation room, Melissa was subjected to hours of relentless questioning. Detectives pushed her to explain the bruises on Mariah's body, their tone growing harsher with each passing minute. Melissa denied harming her daughter repeatedly, her voice cracking under the weight of grief and confusion. "I didn't do it," she insisted over and over again. But the officers weren't satisfied. They accused her of lying, of hiding the truth. Exhausted, overwhelmed, and grieving, Melissa eventually muttered, "I guess I did it. I'm responsible." The words would later be interpreted as a confession, but those close to the case would argue that they were the words of a broken woman, cornered and desperate to end the relentless interrogation. Experts who reviewed the case later described Melissa's confession as coerced, noting her history of compliance and vulnerability in high-pressure situations. But at the time, her words were enough for investigators to charge her with capital murder. For them, the bruises, combined with her perceived confession, painted a clear picture of abuse. In the days that followed, the story of Mariah Alvarez's death spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of the community and beyond. To some, it was a cut-and-dry case of a mother who had failed to protect, or worse, actively harmed her child. To others, it was a tragic misunderstanding, a rush to judgment fueled by the unimaginable pain of losing a child. Mariah's funeral was a somber affair. Family members and friends gathered to mourn the little girl who had been taken too soon. Among them was Melissa, shackled and under heavy police supervision. The image of a grieving mother in handcuffs left an indelible mark on everyone who saw it, raising questions about justice, grief, and the heavy hand of the law. For the authorities, the case was moving quickly, but for Melissa, time seemed to stand still. Behind bars, she faced the reality of her situation. She was being accused of a crime she insisted she hadn't committed, The bruises on Mariah's body, which Melissa attributed to her daughter's fall and underlying health issues, were now the center of a murder investigation. The case against Melissa Lucio was building, but it wasn't just evidence that would shape her fate. It was perception. The image of a struggling mother with a large family, living in poverty, became an easy target for accusations. As the days turned into weeks, Melissa's world unraveled, setting the stage for a trial that would forever alter her life. Meanwhile, Mariah's death left an aching void in her family. Her siblings, too young to fully grasp what had happened, struggled with the absence of their baby sister. The community, divided in their opinions, debated whether Melissa was a cold-blooded killer or a mother caught in the tragic crosshairs of an unforgiving system. The weight of Mariah's loss hung heavy, not just over her family, but over the courtroom where her mother would soon stand trial. It was a tragedy that would ripple far beyond that small Texas town, sparking debates about justice, motherhood, and the flaws in a system that demands answers, even if those answers come at the cost of the truth. The trial of Melissa Lucio was a dramatic spectacle that would come to define her life and the fight for justice in her case. From the moment she entered the courtroom, the odds seemed stacked against her. The prosecution was determined to paint her as an abusive and negligent mother, one whose actions had directly led to the tragic death of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez. For them, the bruises on Mariah's body and Melissa's seemingly reluctant confession were enough to build their case. The courtroom was filled with an uneasy silence as the prosecution laid out their argument. Graphic photos of Mariah's bruised body were shown to the jury, each image more heartbreaking than the last. Prosecutors emphasized the severity of her injuries, claiming that they could only have been caused by sustained abuse. They described Melissa as a woman overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood, someone who lashed out in frustration and anger. But there was more to the story than the jury heard. While the prosecution leaned heavily on Melissa's so-called confession, the defense argued that it was coerced, a product of hours of relentless interrogation when Melissa was at her most vulnerable. Experts later described her demeanor during the interrogation as compliant and submissive, characteristics often seen in individuals who falsely confess under pressure. Yet the defense failed to present this in court effectively. One of the most critical issues with Melissa's trial was the lack of expert testimony. The defense did not call medical professionals who could have explained that Mariah's injuries were consistent with an accidental fall, as Melissa had maintained. Nor did they bring in specialists to challenge the validity of her confession or provide insight into her psychological state at the time of her interrogation. The absence of these key witnesses left a void in Melissa's defense, one that the prosecution exploited fully. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Melissa's background was being used against her. The prosecution highlighted her struggles with poverty, her history of drug use, and the challenges of raising 14 children. To them, this painted a picture of a mother unable to cope, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But to her supporters, this narrative was unfair, ignoring the immense love Melissa had for her children and the systemic issues that had put her in such a precarious position. The jury was left to grapple with conflicting emotions. On one hand, they saw a grieving mother who insisted that Mariah's death was a tragic accident. On the other, they were presented with a mountain of circumstantial evidence that pointed to guilt. The prosecution's portrayal of Melissa as a neglectful and abusive parent loomed large, swaying their perception. After deliberating, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of capital murder. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Melissa, who had maintained her innocence throughout, broke down in tears. Her family, seated behind her, wept openly. For the prosecution, it was a victory. But for Melissa and her supporters, it was the beginning of a nightmare. When the sentence was announced, death by lethal injection, Melissa's fate was sealed. It was a moment of finality that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The mother of 14 was now condemned to die for a crime she swore she hadn't committed. Melissa's life on death row began with unimaginable isolation and despair. Locked away from her family and the outside world, she had nothing but time to reflect on the events that had led her there. For years, she replayed the interrogation in her mind, questioning how things had gone so wrong. She thought about Mariah constantly, her sweet face and giggle haunting her dreams and her waking hours. Her children, now scattered among relatives in foster care, were her primary source of strength. Melissa wrote them letters, pouring her heart onto the page, assuring them of her love and her innocence. These letters became a lifeline, a fragile connection to the world she had been ripped away from. But Melissa didn't give up hope. Over time, she began working with a new legal team, one determined to uncover the truth about her case. They pored over the evidence, identifying critical flaws in the prosecution's arguments and the defense's handling of the trial. They discovered that key evidence had been overlooked, including testimony from medical experts who believed Mariah's injuries were consistent with an accidental fall. Meanwhile, Melissa's story began to gain traction outside the prison walls. Advocacy groups like the Innocence Project took up her case, shining a spotlight on the systemic failures that had led to her conviction. They argued that Melissa was a victim of tunnel vision, with investigators and prosecutors rushing to judgment without fully examining the evidence. As word spread, Melissa's case became a rallying cry for those fighting against the death penalty. Her story was emblematic of the risks of wrongful convictions, especially for vulnerable individuals like Melissa, who had faced immense pressure during her interrogation. For her supporters, her case wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about exposing the flaws in a justice system that had failed her. Inside her cell, Melissa clung to hope. She prayed daily, finding solace in her faith and the knowledge that people were fighting for her. Her children, now grown, began to reconnect with her, offering their love and support. Each visit, each letter became a source of strength, reminding her that she was not alone in her fight for justice. Melissa's time on death row was marked by moments of despair and hope. She struggled with the knowledge that her life could end at any moment, but she also found resilience in the growing movement to save her. Her case became more than just a legal battle. It became a symbol of the human cost of a flawed system, one that often prioritized punishment over truth. As the years passed, Melissa's story reached new heights, drawing attention from activists, politicians, and even celebrities like Kim Kardashian. The fight to save her was far from over, but for the first time there was a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail. And for Melissa, that hope was enough to keep going. As Melissa Lucio's case gained traction, it began to transcend the confines of the courtroom and the prison walls. Advocacy groups, journalists, and individuals deeply concerned about the death penalty rallied around her story. Her tale of a grieving mother, wrongfully convicted, resonated with people who saw her as a victim of a flawed system. But it wasn't until high-profile figures like Kim Kardashian became involved that her fight for justice truly entered the public consciousness. Kim Kardashian, known not just for her celebrity status but also for her efforts in criminal justice reform, came across Melissa's case through advocacy organizations. Outraged by the details, Kim used her massive platform to amplify Melissa's story. She shared posts about Melissa's plight with her millions of followers, urging them to learn about the case and join the fight to stop her execution. Kim highlighted the inconsistencies in the evidence, the coerced confession, and the lack of proper defense during Melissa's trial. "Melissa Lucio doesn't deserve to die," Kim tweeted. "She's a mother who has already lost her child. We need to demand justice and stop this execution before it's too late." Kim's post sparked a wave of interest in Melissa's case. Hashtags like "Mfalken Save Melissa Lucio" and "Ensuring Justice for Melissa" began trending, and petitions calling for her clemency gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. The case became a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system: rushed investigations, coerced confessions, and the devastating impact of poverty and systemic bias. But it wasn't just social media that drew attention to Melissa's case. In the Texas state legislature, a bipartisan coalition of lawmakers joined the call to stop her execution. Republican and Democratic representatives alike wrote letters to Governor Greg Abbott and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, urging them to reconsider her sentence. Some lawmakers visited Melissa on death row, moved by her humanity and her unwavering claims of innocence. The political pressure began to mount. As Melissa's execution date approached, protests erupted outside the state capitol and in cities across the country. Activists held vigils, marched through the streets, and staged rallies to demand justice. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, a mix of anger and hope as people fought to save a woman many believed had been wrongly condemned. Kim Kardashian's involvement brought the story to national attention, but it also attracted criticism. Opponents argued that celebrities had no place in influencing criminal justice cases, accusing Kim of exploiting the case for publicity. But for Melissa's supporters, Kim's efforts were a lifeline, a way to bring attention to a case that might otherwise have been forgotten. As the execution date loomed, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals intervened, granting Melissa a stay of execution just days before she was scheduled to die. The decision brought a moment of relief to her supporters, but it was far from the end of the fight. The court ordered a review of her case, citing new evidence and concerns about the fairness of her trial. The fight to save Melissa Lucio's life wasn't just a legal battle, it was a political and moral one, and it unfolded against the backdrop of a polarized national debate about the death penalty. In Texas, one of the leading states for executions, Melissa's case became a lightning rod for both sides of the argument. Governor Greg Abbott, a staunch supporter of capital punishment, found himself under intense scrutiny. Advocates called on him to grant clemency, pointing to the doubts surrounding Melissa's guilt and the growing evidence that Mariah's death had been an accident. But Abbott remained silent, his office refusing to comment on the case as the pressure mounted. At the same time, Melissa's case highlighted the broader issue of wrongful convictions in capital punishment cases. Statistics showed that since 1973, over 190 people had been exonerated from death row in the United States. Melissa's supporters argued that her case could easily add to that number if given a fair review. The stay of execution bought Melissa time, but it also brought new challenges. The case was sent back to the trial court, where her legal team worked tirelessly to present the evidence that had been overlooked during her original trial. They brought in medical experts who testified that Mariah's injuries were consistent with a fall, not abuse. They presented psychological evaluations of Melissa, showing that she was especially vulnerable to coercion during her interrogation. Meanwhile, public support for Melissa continued to grow. Protests outside the Texas Capitol became larger and louder, with signs reading "Justice for Melissa" and "Stop executing innocent people." Vigils were held across the country, with people lighting candles and sharing prayers for a woman many had never met but felt deeply connected to. Kim Kardashian continued to use her influence to keep the case in the spotlight. She spoke directly to lawmakers, urging them to act, and collaborated with organizations like the Innocence Project to push for reforms in the justice system. "This isn't just about Melissa," Kim said in an interview. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The media played a critical role in shaping public perception of the case. Investigative journalists revisited the details of Mariah's death, uncovering flaws in the original investigation and trial. They highlighted the systemic issues that had contributed to Melissa's conviction: poverty, a lack of proper legal representation, and a justice system that often prioritizes convictions over the truth. As Melissa waited for the court's decision, her story became a symbol of hope and resilience. Behind bars, she maintained her faith and her belief that the truth would prevail. Her children, now adults, spoke out on her behalf, sharing memories of their mother as a loving and caring woman who would never harm her child. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For Melissa, the fight was about more than her life. It was about clearing her name and honoring the memory of her daughter. For her supporters, it was a chance to shine a light on the injustices of the death penalty and demand a system that values humanity and fairness. The world was watching, waiting to see whether Melissa Lucio would be granted the second chance she so desperately deserved. The case had become more than just one woman's story. It was a battle for justice, compassion, and the truth. The outcome would not only determine Melissa's fate, but also send a powerful message about the kind of society we choose to be. Mariah Alvarez's tragic death left a gaping wound in the hearts of her family and community, but the consequences rippled far beyond her immediate circle. While Melissa Lucio sat on death row, the division within her family over what truly happened to Mariah grew more pronounced. This divide mirrored the larger societal debate that her case had sparked. For some, Melissa was a grieving mother who had been unjustly condemned by a system quick to judge. For others, the bruises on Mariah's body and the trauma of her short life pointed to an undeniable truth. Someone had failed her, and Melissa was at the center of it all. For Melissa's children, the weight of this tragedy was almost unbearable. They had lost their sister and, in many ways, their mother too. Growing up apart, separated by foster care and relatives, they clung to fragments of their memories of Melissa. Her laugh, her hugs, the way she sang to them when they were scared. As they grew older, many of them became outspoken advocates for her, insisting on her innocence and sharing stories of her love and devotion as a mother. She wasn't perfect, one of her daughters said in a rare interview, but she loved us. She loved Mariah. She would never hurt her. Still, not everyone in the family shared this view. Some extended family members couldn't reconcile their grief with the circumstances of Mariah's death. The bruises on Mariah's body, the internal injuries, it was too much to dismiss. While they didn't want to see Melissa executed, they also struggled with the idea of complete exoneration. "We just want the truth," one relative said. "We want to know what really happened that day." The emotional turmoil within the family was echoed in the broader public. Advocacy groups highlighted the family's pain, reminding people that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a deeply human tragedy. Protesters carried signs not just for Melissa, but for Mariah, her bright smile now a symbol of innocence lost. Mariah's name became a rallying cry for justice on both sides of the debate, each claiming to fight in her memory. The turning point in Melissa's case came when new evidence began to surface, challenging the narrative that had led to her conviction. Medical experts reviewed the case and found glaring inconsistencies in the prosecution's argument. The injuries that had been presented as evidence of abuse, bruises, internal bleeding, and head trauma, were now being re-examined through a different lens. Experts testified that these injuries could have been caused by Mariah's fall down the stairs, the very explanation Melissa had given from the start. One expert, a pediatric forensic pathologist, provided compelling testimony. "The evidence strongly supports that Mariah's injuries were the result of an accidental fall," she explained. "There is no definitive proof of long-term abuse or intentional harm." This starkly contrasted with the narrative the jury had been told during Melissa's trial. It raised questions about why such testimony hadn't been presented in the original proceedings. Melissa's legal team also brought forward evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. They revealed that during the trial, critical pieces of evidence that could have supported Melissa's innocence were suppressed. Reports detailing Mariah's history of health problems and vulnerability to injuries had been ignored. Additionally, the interrogation techniques used on Melissa were dissected by psychological experts, who explained how her history of trauma and compliance made her especially susceptible to coercion. The coerced confession was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence to unravel. During her original trial, prosecutors had relied heavily on Melissa's statement, "I guess I did it," as an admission of guilt. But experts in false confessions provided a different interpretation. "This wasn't an admission of guilt," one expert said. "It was the response of a woman overwhelmed by grief, exhaustion, and relentless pressure from interrogators." These findings cast serious doubt on the integrity of Melissa's conviction. As this new evidence came to light, the media frenzy intensified. Investigative journalists dug into the details of Melissa's case, uncovering the systemic failures that had led to her death sentence. Documentaries and podcasts dedicated entire episodes to her story, shining a spotlight on the flaws in the justice system. Headlines like "A Mother Condemned," "The Melissa Lucio Case," and "Injustice on Death Row" flooded the news cycle, drawing attention from people who had never before considered the possibility of wrongful convictions. Public opinion continued to shift. Protests grew larger, and petitions for Melissa's clemency reached over 1 million signatures. Social media became a powerful tool for spreading awareness, with supporters sharing posts, videos, and hashtags demanding justice. Kim Kardashian's involvement brought even more visibility. "How can we call this justice?" she asked in an emotional Instagram post. "The evidence shows this was a tragic accident, not a crime. We can't let an innocent woman die." But the fight wasn't just playing out in the court of public opinion. It was also unfolding in the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The court's decision to grant Melissa a stay of execution had given her a temporary reprieve, but it also meant her case was under intense scrutiny. Her legal team filed appeals, presenting the new evidence and calling for her conviction to be overturned. Meanwhile, the prosecution argued that the jury's original verdict should stand, insisting that the evidence of abuse was clear. The tension surrounding the case reached a boiling point. For Melissa, every day was a mix of hope and fear. Her letters to her children reflected this emotional roller coaster. "I miss you all so much," she wrote. "I pray every day that we'll be together again. I believe in God's plan, but some days it's so hard to keep going." Her faith and the support of her family kept her strong, but the uncertainty weighed heavily on her. For her supporters, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Melissa's case had become a symbol of the broader fight against the death penalty and the push for criminal justice reform. Activists argued that her conviction was a miscarriage of justice, emblematic of a system that often prioritizes punishment over truth. They demanded not just clemency for Melissa, but systemic changes to prevent similar cases in the future. As the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals deliberated, the world waited anxiously. Would the court acknowledge the flaws in Melissa's conviction and grant her a new trial? Or would they uphold the original sentence, paving the way for her execution? The outcome would not only determine Melissa's fate, but also send a powerful message about the values and priorities of the justice system. What do you think about Melissa Lucio's case? Should the new evidence be enough to overturn her conviction? Or do you believe the original verdict should stand? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in the fight for truth and justice, share this video to help keep Melissa's story alive. Together we can make a difference.